Hello again, Dan Alasso here for Lifelong Learners, and today I am bringing you the almost final draft of Chapter 4 of my new version of the handbook that I'm revising and adding to, which will be called How to Read, Research, Make Notes, and Write. And Chapter 4 is called Techniques of Highlighting and Taking Notes. And it begins, as we always do, with two epigrams. The first one is, everyone mines every book for the things that are useful to him, especially books that are rich and complex. And that is from Italo Calvino, who lived from 1923 to 1985 and was a famous Italian novelist. And the second one is from an American. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. And that is from Henry David Thoreau, who lived from 1817 to 1862. Now, you may have already noticed in this chapter title that I used the words taking notes rather than what I typically say, making notes. And this isn't accidental. Even when the ultimate goal is to make ideas our own, there is still something that we do that it does seem appropriate to call note-taking. And this is what we're doing when we're in a class and we write down what a lecturer is saying, or a speaker at a meeting, or when we jot down a couple of ideas that we want to remember from a podcast or a video or from an article. And these are notes and ideas that we have taken from another source. And then when we make our own source and point notes, we're beginning to form ideas of our own. So it's appropriate to call the first stage of just jotting down something note-taking. But then let's continue that process and develop our own ideas and begin to give ourselves credit as makers. And both of those quotes that I mentioned at the beginning are basically talking about the same thing. Everything we read and everything we experience is valuable material for our own minds. You may have heard pundits say in recent years that America has shifted away from being primarily busy making things and has become more of an information economy. More Americans than ever before have become knowledge workers of one type or another. What we're talking about here, thinking about texts or experiences and then turning them into insights, definitely qualifies as knowledge work. So let's examine these quotes a little bit more closely. Italo Calvino used the metaphor of mining, suggesting that we dig beneath the surface of things, perhaps to find an iron ore that will become steel girders supporting our structures of interpretation. That's a good metaphor. And Thoreau, can you believe he only lived to be 45 years old? He wanted to suck the marrow out of life, like a hunter-gatherer intent on getting all of the possible nutrition out of his prey. Or like a modern-day chef who roasts and then breaks up large bones and then boils them for hours and hours for stock because that's where the flavor is. And these are both useful metaphors. We can imagine mining the information that we encounter, following veins and seams underground, and then smelting and refining the ore into useful metals that we can do something with. Occasionally, in our digging, we might come across gems that are nearly perfect when we discover them. Perhaps they need only a little bit of cutting and polishing to reveal their real beauty. But most of the time, the work involves patience and effort as we go through the steps of finding and collecting and refining and concentrating information from a raw material into exactly what we need for our structure, and then ultimately to the structure itself. Or we can also picture ourselves collecting bones, breaking them and roasting them for hours or days in a stockpot to release the nutritious and tasty marrow. In both metaphors, the process takes time and it takes effort. And this is also accurate. You've probably heard the saying that was attributed to Thomas Edison, that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Whether or not he was correct about the exact proportions, Edison's point was a good one. People sometimes imagine working with ideas is essentially different from other types of work, that knowledge workers are a special elite, or maybe they just believe themselves to be. But in fact, working with ideas is just like any other type of work. It can be very exciting at times. It can also often be very routine and repetitive. But much of the value and most of the inspiration, whether it's 1% or 10% or more, comes directly out of that less exciting, more work-like part. When we're working with ideas, the information that we're processing is just another raw material. We apply techniques and we use tools to turn this raw material into something that'll be useful and valuable to our purposes. The techniques and the tools that we're going to discuss in this section on note-taking and then note-making are focused mostly on texts, but they can be applied to ideas that come to you from discussion, from listening to lectures, from a scientific experiment, or from your own life experience. The first step in creating new knowledge and reporting on it is finding sources and learning from texts. As I've mentioned, there are several ways to approach a text, depending on what you're hoping to get from it. You might find yourself assigned to read something that you know nothing about. Or you might choose to read a text because it has been recommended or has been cited by somebody else. Or you might be reading with a specific question in mind. And we'll discuss the details of these three reading processes as we continue in this section. For now, I have a few observations. 1. The way that you are going to engage with a text depends on what you're hoping to learn from it. If you're looking for a particular piece of data to answer a specific question, then you're probably going to read much more quickly and inspectively with that goal in mind. And this is what Calvino was saying about everyone mining the book for what's useful to him. If it's a large text, you may be searching for a needle in a haystack, and you may not end up paying a lot of attention to each individual stalk of straw, since you'll be focused on finding your needle. Second, this type of hyperfocus is a lot different from the type of openness to the author's intentions that you might want to practice and that you might be asked to practice if you're reading a novel for a literature class, for example. Although it is probably impossible for readers to actually make themselves into completely blank slates and bring absolutely no expectations or preconceptions to a text. There are times when it's helpful to try to be as open to surprise and to let an author tell their story or make their argument or offer their interpretation without prejudgment. And then third, I'm not implying that openness is something that you need more with literature and focus should be reserved for nonfiction. There will be times in both genres when it will be appropriate to approach a text with a specific question in mind, and other times when a better strategy will be to let that text surprise you. And we do read different texts for different reasons, regardless of the genre or the subject. It's probably useful to know, however, that when we're hyper-focused and we're looking for that needle of data, we may be missing other things that might be valuable in the haystack. That's not necessarily a problem. We're usually not planning on burning the haystack after we find that needle that we're looking for. We can always return to see what else the author might have had to say about other topics. Some of them might be adjacent to that needle topic we were pursuing, and others could take us in entirely different directions. And this is one of the great things about engaging with other people's ideas. Often, their interests are just a little bit different from yours and can take you in directions that you might not have anticipated. By now, you've probably learned in an English class that authors use devices like plot, imagery, symbolism, and allusion to express ideas and values in literature. We often forget that the authors of nonfiction do this too. using pretty much the same set of language or rhetorical tools. This is how reporters write the news, and this is how historians tell stories. Even physicists, when they leave their equations behind and try to describe their discoveries to the rest of us in plain English, find themselves employing analogies, metaphors, and other language tools that we all use. Writing an interpretive essay uses these same language tools. So as you're learning to recognize how different authors have done their work, remember that you're going to be doing it too. When you take notes on a lecture or a video, you're beginning this writing process. Yes, if it's for a class, you're probably also recording information that might be on an exam. But you're also hearing an argument. The speaker isn't just reciting some random set of facts off the top of her head when she lectures. Most lectures are built around a central question or idea. If the lecturer doesn't come right out and tell you what that is, and a clue might be, does the syllabus have lecture titles? Are they in the form of questions? But if it's not clear, try to figure it out. If it doesn't come to you in the class, then review your notes later and try to boil the lecture's theme down to a sentence or two. If you're really stumped, ask the lecturer. She wants to be understood, so your confusion might let her know that she wasn't as clear as she had maybe hoped to be. You'll want to take notes when you read, too. You've probably learned some general ideas about how most writers work, how they generally organize arguments, and how they generally use setting and point of view to create atmosphere and mood, how they generally present narrators and characters to engage problems and advance a plot that tries to resolve a conflict. These are valuable clues to help you begin determining what a text might mean in general. Your task is to analyze them in the specific context of a particular text that you're reading and interpret how they make that contraption work. You will probably find, once you get used to it, that this type of active reading doesn't diminish, but actually increases the pleasure that you get from a text. As you read or listen, your highlights or rough notes should explore both the facts in the text, who did what, when they did it, where, how, and if it's indicated, why, and what interpretations the facts might suggest. But don't be too surprised if facts and interpretations are sometimes difficult to distinguish. And there's a reason why we discuss texts in groups, rather than each of us pondering them on our own in private. We're all looking for the truth of our subject, whether it's a non-fiction article or a novel. But that truth will probably look slightly different from each of our unique perspectives. As Franz Kafka once noted in his diary, one person cannot express the truth, but a host of perspectives might come close to this goal. I usually tell my students that discussions go more smoothly and more productively if the students have already read the assignment and have begun a dialogue with the text before they come to class. And that used to mean underlining or highlighting interesting passages and writing a few questions and comments in the margins of the book. More recently, I've discovered that active measures, such as actually writing down their thoughts after reading, will help students remember much more than just highlighting. The effort involved in writing a note in their own words, which instructional designers sometimes like to call a desirable difficulty, helps to shift the idea from short-term to long-term memory. And this is the same reason that some note makers are shifting back to handwriting on cards rather than depending on automated apps that might sweep their highlights from their ebook into a note-making program. I've found that if students have written some notes and thoughts about a reading, they arrive in class ready to be an active member of an exploratory party looking at the text, rather than just a passive fellow traveler who's merely along for the ride. So, how much and what should you highlight when you begin to work with a text? How much can vary widely, based on why you're reading and what the text is. Generally, though, it's a good rule of thumb to shoot for roughly orders of magnitude. Try to highlight at most about 10% of the text. Then try to write 10 source notes based on each 100 interesting highlights. Then try to write just 1 or 2 point notes from each of the 10 source notes. Now this is obviously going to vary, and if it does vary, say you highlight 20% of a particularly interesting text and write 20 source notes and then 5 point notes, don't worry about this. The next book might interest you less, and there's nothing wrong with learning more than you had expected to. But what should you be highlighting? Begin again with anything that just jumps out at you as interesting. Something that you want to be sure you don't forget. And then add anything that you have questions about, that you don't understand, that you'd like explained. Start with basic questions that clarify facts, and then move on to interpretations. Compare the reading with other readings that you've done, or with lecture and discussion notes. Add questions that reflect your interests and your concerns. These are usually the issues that will lead to good discussions and later to good essays. Here are some questions that you might want to consider and answer for yourself as you read, divided between fiction and nonfiction, and you can use whatever fits. For fiction, or mostly for fiction, if it's a narrative, who's telling the story? Is the narrator reliable or unreliable? Biased? Recognizing the narrator's point of view is going to help you evaluate the facts of the story. And then, what is the setting and the tone? Next, what are you allowed to see, hear, taste, touch, smell, and to feel, both physically and emotionally? Next, is there a sense of comedy, tragedy, irony? Next, who are the major and minor characters? What are their concerns? What motivates them? Who are you supposed to identify with? Next, what kind of language is being used? What level of diction? And what might that indicate? Next, how is the plot structured? How are the issues and problems organized? Are there challenges and responses? Then, is there a recognizable archetype, a hero's journey, or a classical tragedy, that type of thing? Next, what types of images and motifs recur? What kinds of terms and patterns are repeated? Can you recognize metaphors? And if so, to what do you think they point? And then finally, how does it end? What is resolved, or what's left unresolved? What's the significance of the ending? And why does it end where it does? And then a slightly shorter list for nonfiction. And again, mostly for nonfiction. You can use any of these that apply to anything that you read. But for nonfiction, who is the author? What is the author's background? Is the author qualified to be an authority on the material in the piece? In publishing circles, this used to be called platform. Next, who was the original audience for the text? How does the author feel about that audience? Are they allies, opponents, neutral readers that the author is trying to convince of something? Next, what is the author's intention? Is the text an explanation? Is it a polemic? Is it a celebration? Why was it written? And then finally, how is the argument structured? Does the author appeal to logic or to emotion? And what type of argument does the author use? Fiction and usually nonfiction works are generally built around narrative and argument. Although you'll often find that narrative can also be a sneaky form of argument. Most readers are familiar with the basic forms of arguments that go all the way back to descriptions by Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BCE. He was a student of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great. Aristotle recognized logical syllogisms as the most powerful types of arguments. In a syllogism, a series of agreed-upon premises leads inexorably to an irrefutable conclusion. Unfortunately, most of the time, people don't have the advantage of being able to argue from premises that are incontrovertible facts. The most interesting arguments are usually not actually the ones where the conclusion is obvious and irrefutable. Sometimes an author's job is to show his readers new facts in order to lead them to a conclusion. And a note on genders here. I used her last time. I'm going to switch back and forth between the genders rather than trying to make everything plural and avoid the gender issue. So I'll say that again. Sometimes an author's job is to show his readers new facts in order to lead them to a conclusion. Other times, what people are really arguing about is the truth or falsehood of the premises. We live in a world of uncertainty, after all. So many of our arguments are based on premises that are tentative, leading to probable rather than absolute conclusions. Sometimes authors go to great lengths to pretend that their premises are sound and that their conclusions are irrefutable. It's our job as readers to notice that and to come to our own conclusions. This may all seem ridiculously abstract. We don't spend that much time these days taking apart the ways we think and looking at the parts. But when a political author makes a claim such as markets should be unregulated, or says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, there's a trail of argument supporting that statement and leading to it. If you want to understand, or if you want to challenge the claim, the best place to look is at the premises that lead to that conclusion. The form of argument that we've been discussing here is called deduction. It tries to build from accepted facts to a specific conclusion. There are two other forms that authors use frequently. Induction goes more or less in the opposite direction, starting with observations or evidence, like data in a scientific experiment, or even anecdotes of experiences, and then arriving at a general conclusion. Since in the real world, we never have a chance to look at all the data, these conclusions are always, by definition, tentative. But in life, we often take inductive ideas as facts. We know what's going to happen when we throw a ball. Not because we've studied physics and calculus, but because we've done it many times and have experienced the results. Even so, careful scientists still talk about the theory of gravity or the theory of evolution. They don't do this because the scientists aren't convinced that gravity or evolution is correct, but because there's always the possibility that new evidence will be found that will require them to adjust the theory. The point is, inductive reasoning is supposed to follow where that data leads it. You might be surprised that Aristotle actually identified a third form of argument: narrative. Stories are so much a part of the human experience that they are incredibly persuasive. The historian Hayden White defined history itself as a verbal artifact that we use to, in his words, combine a certain amount of data, theoretical concepts, explaining these data, and a narrative structure for their presentation. Stories and anecdotes persuade us because we identify with the people and the situations that are being described. A good story can even sometimes take the place of data, that is induction, or even of agreed upon facts, that is deduction, in an argument. The most powerful stories can reach right past the logical appeal of reason to bring the emotions of the audience into play. Fear, pride, contentment, resentment, love, and moral outrage are all powerful elements of argument. So it's important to be able to recognize whether a writer is appealing to reason or to emotion. And then it's usually relevant to ask why. In the next chapter, I will talk a little bit more specifically about making source notes, and I'll give you some examples of those. But that's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.